Hey everybody, this is Kevin Bass with The Kevin Bass Show, also thedietwars.com. And in this episode, part 2 of this video series on Huberman's episode number 63, I will be debunking and dissecting many of the broad and detailed claims that he makes in this podcast. In fact, in this series of podcasts that I will be releasing, I will cover virtually everything, every aspect, every contradiction, every detail, every concept that he introduces in his podcast episode number 63. Correspondingly, this series will be released, as the name indicates, in a series. It is a serialized mini season, as it were, exclusively dedicated to this particular episode. Why have I decided to do this? Well, the main reason is in part 1, I got lambasted for being a little bit too fuzzy. And so I went back to the drawing board over the course of a week and a half and essentially wrote out the details on every single thing that is wrong with Huberman's podcast. And as a result, I'm going to be releasing that in little segments. Now, each of these segments, each of these parts in this series will cover one or two important core concepts. And actually, I think I'm just going to limit it to one, if at all possible. The reason is since it only covers one particular topic, you can reference back to that particular part, that particular episode, whenever anybody's talking about that particular concept on the internet, et cetera, and you want to share and help people to understand at a better level how to understand that concept. So the whole point of this series, which I've just alluded to, is to take somebody who's extremely famous in the health influencer space and then debunk them. Now, the purpose of that is to get out the right information. Now, I could just as easily release all of the right information about sodium, but nobody would much care about that. But it's much more interesting if I do it by completely demolishing. And some people don't like this language. They think it's too aggressive, or they think, oh, you shouldn't be obsessed with quote unquote demolishing people. Yeah, I'm going to basically really take him apart completely, right? And it's not because it's a personal thing. It's not because I'm like being macho. It's just, I don't know any other better way to describe what I'm going to be doing. I'm just going to be taking apart everything he said. And since he's wrong about so many things, it essentially is tantamount to demolishing him. Now, I don't know, I could use some other phraseology, but I'm going to use that one. So please bear with me and don't get too upset about it. Now, but what's the point of demolishing him? Well, the point is that, again, I can take what he said that's wrong and use it as a lever to then teach what's right. So since he's so famous, since he's so interesting to so many people, by debunking him and showing them that he's wrong in certain really important details and many important details, I can then teach people about what's right. It can be just a way of entertaining people into the truth. People love to hear people demolished and debunked on the internet. People love it. It's a genre of science content that people just can't get enough of. And if you're very good at it, as I am, I can use it. I can use this sort of dark thing of destroying another health influencer's podcast episode. I can use it in order to do something good, which is to give people good information. And a lot of people love this sort of format, and they also want the good information. And so we can combine those two into an entertaining format whereby I give people good information in an entertaining format. And that's the point of all of this. That's the point of everything that I do, is to give people the right information, because if other people are already doing that, I wouldn't need to be doing this. I wouldn't need to be debunking anybody. I wouldn't need to be taking apart anybody. There would be no issues. And before I continue on. It's one really important to point out. There's no controversy with a lot of these things, right? It's not a controversy. It's not an argument. It's not a discussion. It's not that I'm dogmatic. I'm not dogmatic. I'm always willing to be open to discuss the evidence. But the thing about most of the people that I take apart and debunk, right? Most of them are not even close to fairly discussing the evidence, right? It's not even a real scientific disagreement. It's just like a total blooper on their end. And as far as Huberman's podcast, this is a total blooper on his end. It's not remotely related to the science. And so there's no real intricate scientific discussion to be had about it. Now, that said, in theory, there might be somebody who's actually a serious scientist who has views that are somewhat similar to his, although I'm not sure who that would be, that maybe could provide some interesting information and interesting insight about some of the things that Huberman is trying to provide insight on. But I can't find who that person is, and I'm not engaging with that person. I'm engaging with essentially blatant misinformation. Okay? So, yeah. The last thing I'll say before I continue is I don't dislike... I've been frustrated by Huberman, but I don't dislike him as a person. I love his charisma. I love his personality. He has so much personality, so much character. I don't always agree with every aspect of that character, but I think he's such an interesting person. And so it's all the more important to point out where he's wrong and that he is wrong on a large number of things, because if that's not done, people will take him as a guru, which I think they shouldn't. In the same way, I don't think they should take Dr. Oz as a guru sometimes. Okay? All right. So nothing personal against Huberman here, despite some of the rhetoric I've had in the past. I want to make that clearer. Okay. Now let's outline the rest of the series, and let's jump into part 2, the content I'm going to make in particular in this part. And so the first thing I'm going to do is introduce the podcast series, as I'm doing now. Second thing, I'll talk about the sodium paradox, which Huberman bases his claims about the healthfulness of sodium on. I will talk about the health paradoxes more generally. In fact, there's a lot of these. This so-called J-shaped curve. We can see this here, actually. Let's look at this. This is a so-called health paradox, right? And this is from the Element website, which I'm going to be discussing in a moment. And this is from the paper that he cites in the podcast, suggesting that the optimum sodium intake is higher than the recommendations on the basis of this observational study, this multinational observational study. This is a health paradox because the recommendations and most of the evidence points to lower intakes always being better, even down to as low as 500 milligrams per day, which is, as you'd see on this particular graph figure, it's at the very bottom. It's below even the numbers at which it's considered still healthy to consume sodium is below even this gray line, right? And it's considered healthy for avoiding death, avoiding cardiovascular disease, all the way down to that level. Okay? But yet we have this study here, as you can see, this multinational study, this observational study that shows that people who have higher intakes have better health outcomes, have lower risk of death. Lower risk of death. Okay? So it suggests that optimal health outcomes are actually better whenever you have higher intake. Well, guess what? As I said, there's many of these health paradoxes that suggest such a thing. Let's mention a couple. There's what's called the cholesterol paradox, right? Where higher cholesterol levels suggest a lower rate of death, despite the fact that randomized controlled trials say the opposite. There's also the obesity paradox, which suggests that people who are overweight, and in some cases even obese in some versions of the obesity paradox, actually have better outcomes. So it's more healthy to be obese than it is to be normal weight. Okay? It's more healthy to be obese than it is to be normal weight, according to this paradox, right? The obesity paradox. Just like it's more healthy to have hyperlipidemia, high LDL cholesterol. In the cholesterol paradox, it's more healthy, according to the obesity paradox, to be obese, right? There's also the blood pressure paradox, which shows the same thing. It's healthier to have a higher blood pressure, and to have a lower blood pressure is actually less healthy, according to this paradox. Now, these health paradoxes, these are all based on observational data, which are low quality data and are confounded, which I'll be talking about in that particular part of the podcast, which will be the next part 3 of the podcast. They're not reliable pieces of evidence, and all of these paradoxes are in fact not paradoxes, but are methodological misreadings of the scientific literature. And the hat on which Huberman hangs, the rack on which Huberman hangs his hat, this particular paradox is an illusion, which I'll be explaining in part 3. Okay, but the third thing I'll discuss is the designs, strengths, and weaknesses of randomized controlled trials versus observational studies. So I'm going to give you guys a crash course in why and how to use and think about randomized controlled trials versus observational studies. So anytime you come across randomized controlled trials versus observational studies, you'll have a really good understanding about how to approach this bit of scientific literature and understand the strengths and weaknesses of each. And in doing so, you will also have a broader understanding of these so-called health paradoxes, because the differences between those two kinds of scientific study designs explains why these health paradoxes exist. And I'll show in particular that randomized controlled trials indicate that these health paradoxes are fallacious. I will dive into the details of the sodium paradox studies in particular. We're going to dive all into those studies. We're going to dive into this study that's cited by Element, which is the study on which Huberman hangs his hat. We are going to dissect it intricately, okay, in part 3 and part 4 of this podcast series, the serialization of this debunking. In the 5th part of the podcast, I will discuss the arguments made by Huberman that because animal models show anxiety on low sodium diets, therefore humans could benefit from higher sodium in their diets. Now, there's a handful of these studies, and they are also mentioned on the Element website, which is an interesting fact that we'll get to in a moment, because almost everything that Huberman talks about is also, interestingly, part of the marketing copy for Element. I will show how Huberman and Element both misuse these studies and misread them in really particularly bad and kind of, in my opinion, embarrassing ways. Okay. In the 6th part of this podcast, I'll examine the claim made by Huberman that because Andy Galpin, who I like very much and who I talk to occasionally and who I have great respect for as a scientist, I once asked him, it was funny, I once asked Andy to train me for jiu-jitsu, to be an athletic trainer. I didn't know what a big shot this guy like Andy was. I had no idea. I've had exchanges with him over the years, and always like really good exchanges. And I have so much respect for him as a scientist. But I didn't know that he trained UFC fighters and Olympians. So I asked him to train me as a BJJ local for a local jiu-jitsu tournament. Not knowing that was the caliber he was. And that was funny. He referred me to somebody else, but that's always a story I love to tell. But in any case, I'll examine the claim made by Huberman that because Andy Galpin recommends a high electrolyte intake during physical activity, such an intake is justified at all times, which is fallacious. Like, Andy's right. Of course, a high electrolyte intake during physical activity, especially when you're going to be sweating and you need those electrolytes, is going to improve in performance. There's no question. Zero question. But is such an intake justified at all times? And if you listen to Huberman's podcast, which you will actually, I'll be taking clips out. He seems to suggest that this means that everybody should, at all times, for cognitive performance and all these other things, be doing it. But there's no evidence he provides for that. He just says, Andy Galpin says we should use it for physical activity. Therefore, we should be drinking this stuff at all times. I point out that Huberman provides no evidence that electrolyte replacement is required to optimize cognitive performance, much less when you're not undergoing physical activity and you're just like giving a talk. and I'll point out that Galpin's claim pertains only to physical performance. Obviously, right? If you're not sweating, why are you replacing your electrolytes? Okay, but we'll talk about that in part 6 of this series. And finally, I address Huberman's discussion about the importance of sodium in neurons. Okay, I'll simply point out the evidence indicates that Americans dramatically overconsume sodium. And again, I provide evidence that this is the case. I then show that his whole story about sodium in neurons is not based on any good science whatsoever. Of course, sodium is used in neurons, yes, but there's no evidence that like the level of sodium that Americans take is anywhere but maybe an order of magnitude greater than what you need to make sure that your neurons are processing correctly. And actually, there's literally zero evidence that supplementing with sodium, especially given the amount that we already take in, is going to help your neurons whatsoever. Like, it's never even been, like, nobody suggests this. Nobody's ever suggested this. Well, probably somebody suggested this, but like, the overwhelming body of evidence actually shows that if you take more sodium, you actually impair cognitive performance. It doesn't show that you help it. You actually impair it. So I don't know where he gets this. Yeah, you can speculate, mechanistic speculation. We've talked about this in earlier episodes. You can speculate from some mechanism saying, oh yes, neurons use sodium to like then say, well, we need more sodium, but like one doesn't follow from the other. Just because neurons use sodium doesn't mean you need to supplement with sodium. It's like saying the body uses glucose or the body uses fat, so you should supplement with glucose or fat. Well, maybe, like if you're not getting enough, right? But if you're getting enough, you're just going to gain weight, right? So it's the same exact issue. If you're getting enough sodium, which everybody is for brain function, almost everybody, except if you have a disease. And there's some people who deplete sodium with drugs, blood pressure medications, who might need it. But apart from those rare cases, everybody's getting way more sodium than they need for their neurons. So you don't need to add more. You're just going to do the sodium equivalent of gaining weight, which is to say you're going to increase blood pressure, increase your risk of stroke and cardiovascular disease, which we'll talk about. Okay, but let's introduce the podcast. So I said, first I'll introduce the podcast, and this is part 2, where I'm going to be introducing the podcast, but I'm going to be doing so in much greater detail than I did for part 1. And that's just simply because it just got a lot of heat. I think people expect a lot from me, right? People expect that everything of mine is going to be great because I'm smart and I'm presenting the science, right? So it has to be like perfect. It has to come across as perfect. It has to come across as super professional. I have to break through the mainstream. And I literally get through in every single one of my videos, I get somebody saying, oh, Kevin, you should do so much better in the quality of your podcast if you want to break through to the mainstream. I'm just like, dude, I'm a PhD student. I'm an MD student. I have 3 children. I have I have an ex-wife I need to make happy, right? I have a PhD I need to graduate from. We're thinking we're doing some cutting edge research in ketogenesis, right? Explaining ketogenesis and ketogenic physiology in a way that maybe we may have a breakthrough that's going to overturn like 100 years of dogma. Like that's what I'm doing right now for my PhD. Right? And hopefully if I do that in my PhD, we'll get a couple sentences in a textbook changed, right? That's what's just cool. That's just, to me, is cool. Makes my PhD worth it. So I'm killing myself for all this stuff. And then I have to know everything in health science, which I'm getting to the point where I know more than like so many people, so many other health influencers. My breadth of knowledge is incredible. And I'm not just saying that to like pat myself on the back. Well, I am patting myself on the back, right? because I've worked hard for this, and then yet I'm also expected to make these super amazingly good produced podcasts. I just can't. Sorry, I'm working on it, but I'm gonna do my best in this part 2 to flesh out what I didn't flesh out in part 1. basically a new introduction. Okay, so that's what I'm doing right now. So as I said, first I'll introduce the podcast. So specifically, I want to extend upon the connection between Dr. Huberman's claims and those on the Elements website. And there's such a deep and close connection between these two. In fact, I think much of Huberman's podcast is actually just him having read marketing copy from the Element website. There's so many parallels between the claims made on the Element website and what Huberman says. I'm just like, like either he got his ideas from Element or he got his ideas from the same place Element got their ideas. And I think it's actually the former. Much of it is the former. But we'll see this in a moment. So in any case, Element is one of Huberman's main sponsors. It provides a 15% commission on each sale using Huberman's link. So if you make a sale using Huberman's link from Element, Huberman gets 15% of that purchase. Okay, that's a lot. Huberman recommends that people buy and consume Element salt-containing products. He in fact mentions the name Element many times in his episode, and he does so in multiple episodes. Element is his sponsor. It's one of his 3 main sponsors that he mentions at the beginning of every episode. Okay? Which is all the more reason, right, for him to get that 15% commission each time. And I know this because I know other affiliates of Element. I have friends who are affiliates of Element. Their names shall not be mentioned, but they've told me that they get 15% commission. Now, this podcast by Huberman covers all of Element's ingredients. He actually covers in this podcast every single ingredient in an element, which is interesting. And actually, in fact, only the ingredients in Element. Also interesting. Sodium, potassium, and magnesium. These are the subjects of his podcast. And he covers potassium, magnesium in very short order, but he makes sure to jackknife them in there. Isn't that interesting? It suggests that this Huberman podcast was made for the purpose of selling Element supplements, as I discussed in part 1. But what's more interesting is that the pivotal study on which Huberman hangs his hat, as I've mentioned already, is precisely the same one as the one featured prominently on the Element website, as I've pointed out here. Okay. Interestingly, there is a good deal of misinformation on this website, and now we're going to talk about that here, which is also reflected in the details given by Huberman. So Huberman actually repeats the same misinformation as on the Element website, which is very interesting. It suggests that, again, he's getting his information straight from Element and making the same mistakes as Element because he's essentially copying the information from Element, including the errors. There's good, okay, I missed my place. For example, the Element website misreports that the average American salt intake is just 2.3 grams daily. So look here. So it says on drinkelement.com/pages/ingredients. And by the way, I want to say a week or 2 ago, I reached out to somebody on Element, one of the Element team. He's actually a friend of mine. I'm not going to mention his name. I'm not going to say he's a friend, but he's somebody I reach out to and I've had good interactions with and who's given me a lot of really good information about different things. And I'm not going to mention who this name is because I don't want to get them in trouble. But I reached out to this person and I pointed out there's some serious problems with the website. They didn't contact me, okay? So I'm just going to take liberty to take it apart, right? Because I gave him foreknowledge. Okay. But we got drinkelement.com/pages/ingredients, right? This is a really interesting part of the website. And in fact, it's in contradiction to other parts. So different parts of the website report this study differently in very dramatic ways. Some parts of the website are accurate, some parts are not. This part of the website is not accurate. So it says, your life with more salt, not less. Okay, you should have more salt in your life, not less. The word is out after decades of misinformed guidance. A growing body of scientific literature is revealing that low sodium levels may indeed be harmful to health. In fact, optimal health outcomes are seen at sodium levels of 2 to 3 times higher than current recommendations from the medical establishment. Okay. All right. And it gives this figure from the JAMA paper that Huberman loves to cite. Okay. Here's where it gets super interesting. It says average healthy intake. It says average salt intake below 2.3 grams daily. Optimal salt intake 5 to 7 grams daily. Now, I'll give you guys a moment to pause and think about what's wrong here. And there's two big problems here. Two ways that are totally messed up. Two things that are just like totally messed up. First is that the recommendations for maximum salt intake, and this is not ideal. Ideal is actually 1500 milligrams sodium. The recommendations for optimal sodium intake, I actually made the same mistake just now as Element makes, and we'll see in a second. The actual recommendation for sodium intake is 2.3 grams. What does this say? Salt intake. Okay. Salt intake. That's the first error. So actually, sodium is only 40% of salt. So when you say salt intake, 2,300 milligrams of salt is actually equal to 5.73 grams of salt. So that's actually the recommended salt intake is 5.73 grams, almost 6 grams of salt per day. There's a recommended maximum. But this is reporting the recommended salt intake at 2.3 grams per day. Okay? But it's also saying it's the average actual salt intake, as if like Americans actually on average consume less than 2.3 grams of salt. That's also not true. That's the recommendation. In fact, average American consumes about 3,500 milligrams of sodium, which equates to about 8 to 9 grams of salt, which is higher than the optimal salt intake listed here, right? So it's like this website itself is like, it already doesn't even know what it's talking about. It's like already the numbers are so weird. And this actually is really important because when you start playing really loose with these numbers, then you can start saying, well, everybody should increase their salt intake, as we'll see in a moment. So let's get there though. So, yeah, as I said, the actual recommended intake of salt is actually almost 6 grams. And it's not 2.3 grams of salt. It's almost 6 grams of salt because sodium is only 40% of salt, right? And interestingly, now here's where it gets interesting. Huberman, at 54 minutes into his podcast, he repeats this error made by Element. He claims that the salt recommendations from the guidelines is equal to half a teaspoon.
Nonetheless, I think the plot that we described, meaning the graph that we described, is pretty interesting in light of the 2020 to 2025 dietary recommendations for Americans, which is that people consume no more than 2.3 grams, meaning 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. That's about a half a teaspoon of salt per day.
But that's not actually the salt recommendation. The salt recommendation is more than a teaspoon. It's 6 grams of salt. Okay. So automatically he's like making the salt recommendations out to be something that are, incredibly low. It's ridiculous, et cetera, et cetera. No, actually it's more than a teaspoon. Okay. Per day, which imagine putting a teaspoon of salt into anything. Putting a teaspoon of salt on your eggs, you're going to kill yourself. Not you're going to kill yourself, but you're not going to want to eat those eggs. Right? You put a quarter of a teaspoon, that's already going to be a lot for those eggs, right? That's already going to be a lot. Just put a quarter teaspoon. So a quarter of your salt intake is already going to be a little bit too much for breakfast. You get me? You guys dig this? You guys understanding this? Because it's not so ridiculous when you start to think about it. When you start to think about the recommendations, it's a lot already, especially if you're eating whole foods. If you're eating only whole foods, you're not eating a bunch of stuff with added salt in it already, and you're adding that salt to stuff, holy crap, that's going to be a lot. Let's say you only eat eggs all day. You're not going to be able to take in that 6 grams of salt. It's going to be too much for your eggs. right? And if you're eating a lot of foods that are similar to that, it's going to be too much salt. And that's the recommendations, okay? All right, so he skews and he misrepresents what the recommendations actually say. And I think this is in part not because of willful intention, it's because this stuff is so confusing on this website. And I think a lot of the information he got was from the marketing copy of the Element website. Okay. And let's get to the point. Let's get to the point here, though. The amount of salt that Americans eat is actually 8 to 9 grams of salt, or nearly 2 teaspoons. The average American eats nearly 2 teaspoons. Imagine using 2 teaspoons, pouring that on your food. If you're just going to pour on your food and you're not going to like put it into pastries and stuff, which you can cover up the salt taste with sugar and all this other ways of making it doesn't seem like you're eating as much salt as you should are. But like, think about putting that on whole foods. 2 teaspoons of salt. That's a ton of salt. And that's the average American. That's the 50th percentile. That's right standard, straight down the mainstream. Okay? Of course, that corresponds to 3,500 grams of sodium. And that's nothing close to half a teaspoon of salt. Man, the average American is consuming 2 teaspoons of salt. Strikingly, however, this 2 teaspoons, and this is where it gets so funny, it's exactly how much Huberman recommends consuming. He tells everybody they should be consuming exactly this amount. And this is at 1 hour, 34 minutes, 37 seconds.
The Salt Fix is an interesting read because it points to, first of all, the history of salt in society and as it relates to health. It actually emphasizes some of the major missteps, maybe even pretty drastic errors that have been made in terms of trying to interpret the role that salt has in various diseases, and emphasizes some of the ways in which perhaps increasing salt can actually improve health outcomes. And I think it strikes a pretty nice balance between what's commonly known about salt and what I believe ought to be known about salt, or at least taken into consideration. You know, the book does provide certain recommendations, and I actually reached out to the author. I've never met him in person or talked to him directly, and I asked him outright. I said, "How much salt do you recommend people take on average?" And he gave, of course, the appropriate caveats about prehypertension, hypertension, et cetera, but made a recommendation which I'll just share with you. And if you want to learn more about the support for this recommendation, you can check out his book. The recommendation he made was anywhere from 8 to 12 grams of salt a day, which corresponds to 3.2 to 4.8 grams of sodium. So going back to the current recommendations that we talked about before, 2.3 grams of sodium per day. This is about 1.5 times to, double the amount of sodium that's currently recommended in most circles. And what this corresponds to is about 1.5 to 2 teaspoons of salt per day to arrive at that 3.2 to 4.8 grams of sodium. Again,
this is the amount consumed by Americans, which is the amount that Huberman's recommending. That's interesting. Despite this, however, Huberman claims that for most people, a moderate increase in salt intake is not going to be detrimental, provided that you consume enough fluids, in particular water. He provides no evidence for this, by the way, but he says this at 1 hour, 2 minutes, 21 seconds.
For most people, a moderate increase in salt intake is not going to be detrimental, provided that you consume enough fluids, in particular water.
Now, which is it? Should Americans consume more salt? Is it not going to be not detrimental to consume more salt? Or is, in fact, the amount of salt that Americans already consume, which is the amount of salt that he recommends, is that enough? Why does he say you should consume more salt than he recommends, right? And it's not going to be detrimental, while also saying more salt than he recommends is not good. At earlier parts of the podcast, he seems a little confused on this point. He starts the podcast by warning about high salt intakes repeatedly, and we'll include a few clips. Then he mentions that people in certain disease states benefit from higher salt intakes. Then he points out that Andy Galpin recommends additional salt for serious exercising athletes. Then he extrapolates from that to say that everyone would benefit from more salt for cognition without providing any evidence. So he goes from saying high salt intakes are bad to, in some disease states they're good, to in athletes they're good, to for cognition they're good. So eat more salt. Here's what James DiNicolantonio says, the amount of salt that you should take in. This amount of salt is very similar, if you actually look at the numbers, to what Americans already consume. I think this is a good amount of salt intake to have. According to Huberman, that's what he's saying. This is DiNicolantonio's recommendation, and Huberman is endorsing it. Yet Huberman's also saying to consume more salt. It's a very confusing episode. And with that bit of confusion introduced to you, my friends, I want to give you the confusion. Well, with that bit of confusion, that is part 2 of this series. And what I've decided to do for viewers and for listeners is provide the breakdown of that discussion of DiNicolantonio's recommendations versus what Americans already consume versus what Huberman recommends and the increases that he ends up recommending in his podcast. I'm providing an extended discussion both in some of the clips that I will be providing as part of this podcast, and it may have been the case that I've already put those clips in here, and so I'm simply referencing what's already going to be in the final product after it's already been placed in, and that's okay. And I'm also going to be including this discussion and these calculations in the description of the video and of the podcast so that you guys can follow along the technical details about why this is so particularly confusing. Now, as I've mentioned, in the next part of this series, I'm going to be talking about the sodium paradox, the obesity paradox, the cholesterol paradox, the blood pressure paradox, and we could even actually include in those the alcohol cardiovascular disease paradox, as well as the heart rate paradox, showing that in most cases, or in general, having lower levels of all of these is much better. But because you look at the observational evidence in a certain kind of way, you can kind of make obesity out to be healthy. You can make high blood pressure out to be healthy. You can make cholesterol to be healthy. You can make sodium intake to be healthy, high heart rate to be healthy, and high alcohol consumption, as many as 3 or 4 drinks per day, to be healthy. And as we now know, these health paradoxes are not really taken that seriously, or they're not taken seriously at all by scientists. There used to be a controversy in some of these areas, but these controversies are being resolved today in the 2020s based on higher quality evidence. It's not believed that these paradoxes indicate anything real. It's not believed that obesity is actually healthy. It's believed that there were problems in those original studies, and problems that are clearly understood and well elucidated by the leading scientists in the field, who continue to assert that having lower rates of obesity with a little bit of caveats for older people, okay, some small caveats for older people, but having lower rates of obesity are in fact healthy, and having higher rates is not. We'll be talking about all of that and the methodological problems, and we'll be diving really deep into those particular paradoxes to explain why, look, they're not paradoxes, they're just things we don't understand, okay? That's going to be part 3, and as I mentioned, part 4, we're going to be diving deep into the relationship between randomized controlled trials and observational epidemiology to give you the tools from here on out to evaluate the quality of any study and understand what it's actually saying, whether it's reported in the media, it's reported on Twitter, Instagram, anywhere. You'll be able to say, hey, is this an observational study or a randomized controlled trial? And we'll even be talking about some of the features of observational studies and randomized controlled trials that you can then use to understand and evaluate these kinds of studies, so that you'll have that knowledge, that information, and that ability for the rest of your lives. And you will no longer fall for the bullshit, as many viewers probably did. in this salt and sodium paradox that Huberman presented on his podcast, as I will be talking about again in greater detail in part 3. So that's part 3 and 4. I hope you guys are looking forward to it. I wish these episodes were shorter. The issue is breaking down this BS takes a lot of time. Also, it can be boring sometimes. I'm trying to make it as interesting as possible. So I hope you have found it interesting. And if you have, please follow me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram at Kevin Nbass, KevinNbass. We also have a new Reddit. There's a new Reddit subreddit dedicated to my show called Kevin Bass. That's it. Kevin Bass. Kevin Bass. Kevin. No 2 N's, just 1 N in this case. Apparently there's also another, there is, I actually founded it. I created it, another Reddit subreddit with KVINNBASS. Apparently there's a way to cause them to redirect to the same subreddit, which I'll be doing. But for our purposes, just go to Kevin Nbass, KVINBASS, and you can follow along and talk about these different episodes with your fellow fans and listeners. It's weird that I have fans. I do have like this devoted following. It doesn't matter what I say anymore. I can say anything and they will continue following me, which is so weird to me. It's like, it's flattering too. It's like that softens my heart a little bit, you know, because it's like, like you, like no matter what I say, like you guys believe in me, and man, that's cool. And people who've been following me for a long time know that often on times I'm just exploring, you know? So don't take things I say too seriously unless I'm really serious and I go into detail and do it over and over again. And I start like, this is the thing, this is the thing, this is the thing. Because sometimes I'm exploring. Now for this stuff, this is pretty solid. This is rock solid. I feel really good about this, like the Huberman sodium stuff for sure. But there's some stuff I'm just like, I'm kind of like exploring. I'm being creative, right? I just took the Hexaco, which, as many of you guys know, the big 5. Okay, many of you guys know about Myers-Briggs, right? So Myers-Briggs is like this personality. People are like ENTPs or INTPs or ENTJs or INTJs or ESTJs and stuff like that. That kind of thing that you may have taken in like school or for business or something. It's outdated now. It's not considered scientific. The scientific one is called the Big 5, right? The Big 5 is like the scientific personality test. It's more of a spectrum as opposed to these discrete dichotomous binary categories. And it captures a lot of the same information. If you dig deep into the literature on this, it captures a lot of the same information, but in a more rigorous manner. It's thought. Now, I find the Myers-Briggs interesting, but Big 5 is considered a little more scholarly. That said, yeah, I don't know how stable these personality traits are, but anyway, so there's another one called Hexaco where they add in another dimension called humility/honesty, right? And I recently took that one because I've already taken Big 5 a couple times and I'm really interested in these psychometric tests. And I score off the charts for creativity, you know, like there's 2 ways I score off the charts. Well, there's a few ways I score off the charts, but like one way I score off the charts is conscientiousness. Like across all subscales, I'm like super conscientious and super like methodical and systematic and careful and like perfectionistic and organized, et cetera, et cetera. Although a lot of people don't know that about me because I'm always like, so the other aspect is I'm off the charts in creativity and I'm unconventional as well, which according to our friend Jordan Peterson, having both of those, being like really orderly and conscientious, along with being really creative and open to experience, it's a rare combination. So you guys can see this in me. Like I'm very systematic and thorough and like almost a savant. Sometimes one person said like I'm savant. Like that's such a weird thing. It's the first time I've ever heard that. But I have this like obsessiveness to detail, but then I also have this creativity, right? I'm always interested in learning and doing new things and expanding and having fun and having a good time with knowledge. So, you guys should check out the Hexaco. It's so much fun. And, but that said, given how conscientious I am, I want to like let you know, sometimes I'm just exploring things, right? And I appreciate and admire, and I don't admire, but I appreciate and am flattered by the fact that people still hold on to, they still are my fans, you know, despite sometimes me changing my positions and exploring and enjoying myself. People still hold on, and like I have like a core of followers. So all that to say is, if you want to join some of these guys, some of these followers, some of these fans in talking about some of my stuff and learning more and having questions like, oh, Kevin said this, what does he mean? Like blah, blah, blah. This can actually help you to learn more, because I can't answer all your questions. It's really hard sometimes. And you guys can also dig into deeper details on some of this stuff, because a lot of this stuff I tell you guys, a lot of you guys already know it, or some of you guys already know it. So the more knowledgeable among you can teach the less knowledgeable, and that would be cool. And I know that there's other influencers who have their own subreddits, and so I'm going to have my own. And so you can check out that subreddit. Okay, so all that to say is like, okay, check out that, and also check out my Patreon if you want to donate. If you think that I'm doing a great job, donate on Patreon. Like seriously, if you follow this stuff and you've been following me for a long time and you've been getting a lot of content out of this, like I literally drive a van, a 1997 Dodge Caravan that's like, it looks like it comes out of a Mad Max movie. Literally. I'm not even kidding. And now I actually crashed it and I smashed it into the back of a pickup truck. Like one side of it is smashed. Look, the more you guys can donate on Patreon or send me stuff, there's people who just sent me, like there's David Podurski, who sent me a bunch of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gear, which is so freaking amazing. There's Andres Pachel, who sent me a bunch of really cool, like he sent me this microphone that I'm using, right? There's Spencer, powered by Spencer on Instagram. That's his username. He sent me Premier Protein because he heard I was short on protein. If you can send me stuff, that's awesome. I actually kind of appreciate the gifts even more. You know, it's like you get a gift card in Christmas. It's not as special as if somebody gets you something nice. So, but I do appreciate monies. But if you guys really appreciate this and you're getting a lot out of it, I would appreciate if you could show your appreciation through that kind of means, because I do need to upgrade my cash game, which is being upgraded for sure. And I will make a shout out to all the people who are supporting. Like I'm getting close to breaking the $1,000 a month mark for monetization, which is unreal. And I couldn't be happier about that. And I appreciate all that. Yeah, but please do continue to help. And you can also go to the.wars.com/support-me, and then you can find out other ways to support and send directly if you need to. Yeah, and then you can also send directly through Twitter. There's a button on Twitter that you can press to send directly. That would be awesome. What else? TikTok, Instagram. There's another platform. Oh yeah, check out the podcast at the Kevin Bass Show on Apple Podcasts, as well as Spotify, and rate and review on Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Especially give a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, because the more people who give a rating and review, the better. The reviews keep going up naturally. Like, how could they not? I got review bombed at the beginning because I've been very unpopular with certain groups of people, but I'm becoming more popular, I think, especially as I mellow out in terms of my delivery, and I'm getting good mentorship there, and which I greatly appreciate. If you are listening, my friend, you know who you are. Yeah. So that's that. And I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast. I'll see you guys around for part 3 and part 4 and part 5 and part 6 and part 7, the million parts of this debunking that we're going to do to cover all these concepts. Talk to you guys later. Peace.